My name's David Walsh, and welcome to Myprotein's brand new podcast called The Scoop, where we do just that. We get you the scoop on the most nail-biting, intense, and controversial topics in fitness, with our expert guests providing the information to help you make your mind up on what to believe. Topics discussed in gyms, homes, pubs, and just about anywhere around the world surrounding sports, nutrition, and training. This is where you get the scoop. Today's topic is a controversial one, but one I'm super interested in, and that is, would sport be more exciting if doping were legal? To discuss this, we have not one, not two, but three guests. Julian Savulescu, a professor in biomedical ethics at Oxford, who has written a number of articles and done TED Talks discussing the ethics of using performance-enhancing drugs. David Walsh, journalist for the Sunday Times, who is the famous author of books exposing Lance Armstrong and doping in cycling. And Kira Toussaint, a Myprotein athlete and Dutch Olympic swimmer who was falsely accused of doping a couple of years ago. Guys, how's it going?
Very good, thanks.
Good, thank you.
Good to have you all on. Well, obviously the topic today is quite a heavy one. So just to break it up a little bit, and for those that don't know or may not know so much about you guys, we're going to kickstart with a brief, quick fire Q&A. David, I'm going to start with you because obviously you're my namesake, you're the same name as me. It's a this or that. It's only about four or five questions. So quick fire, this or that. Ready to go?
Yep.
All right, let's go. Early bird or night owl?
Night owl.
Watching athletics or cycling?
Cycling.
England or Ireland?
Ireland.
What's more important, winning or taking part?
Taking part.
Strong. Very strong. Okay. Kira, we're going to come to you next. Morning or evening training?
Morning.
Amsterdam or London?
Amsterdam.
I knew it. Indoor or outdoor pools?
Outdoor. For training, indoor for competition.
Okay. All right. Okay. And strength or endurance training?
Sprint.
All right. Okay. And Julian, ready to rock and roll?
Yep.
Fiction or non-fiction books?
Fiction.
Watching or competing in sports?
Competing.
Early bird or night owl?
Early for work, night for pleasure.
All right, so starters done. We're going to delve straight into the mains, which is, would sport be more exciting if doping were legal? I'm going to come to you, Julian, to kick this one off.
Well, you're actually looking at a doped sport already. So, the independent estimates put, the number of participants winning in the Olympics or at elite events at 1/3 to 2/3 of doping. So the first thing to realise is you are watching doped sport at the moment. If you were able to legalise doping, what you would see is people who currently are disadvantaged by remaining clean being able to come up to the level of the dopers, and you wouldn't see so many of these medals being removed months or years after they've been won. So it would be much more interesting because you wouldn't have so much doubt about whether the winner's doping or not. Clearly, if you had a free-for-all, you'd have probably a lot of side effects and deaths. But if you regulated doping so that people were within the normal physiological limits, which is what they're doing now, you'd see a much fairer, much more consistent spectacle.
David, I'm going to come to you. What's your thoughts or response to that?
No, I don't agree with that at all. From what Julian has said, I get the impression that it's like the problem is we've got a 70 mile an hour speed limit, and lots of people are breaking that limit, and the cops are pulling one person in, and as that one person is giving his details, other people are going past and not being detected. So let's put the speed limit up to 90, and all those people who are going between 70 and 90 are now within an acceptable limit. But of course what happens then is people want to go at from 90 to 110. And that doesn't actually solve the problem. So I don't see allowing people to take a certain amount of doping as solving any problem. And I would have just a fundamental antipathy to a situation where you're saying to somebody who says, I do not want to put doping product in my body. You're saying to them, well, you're at a disadvantage now because some people cheat. And the way to kind of negatize this inequality is for you to take doping. And again, my feeling has always been that it's everybody's right to compete clean. And it's the ones who want to compete clean that we should all be working for, and all our efforts should be directed towards giving them the playing field, the level playing field that they deserve. Of course, there are people cheating now, and that's not good. But the solution is not to legalize it.
Kira, you got Julian saying there 1/3 to 2/3 of athletes competing, relatively taking some enhancements from that perspective. You as an athlete that's in the sport, what are your thoughts surrounding that as a topic?
Well, maybe I'm really naive, but I really don't believe that 1/3 to 2/3 of my competitors are using doping. Maybe it's just because I really don't want to believe it, but I don't think that's true. And I also don't agree with the statement to just legalize doping for everybody. I think what David has said, that would just move the problem from the 90 miles an hour to the 110 miles. I really believe that is true, because there will always be people that will break the new rules of what is legal in doping use. And I completely disagree with the statement that we should legalize it all, because I think the beauty of sports is that the clean athletes, which we don't know who they are for sure, to see them win and to see them compete and do the things they can do best, I think that's the most beautiful thing in sports.
David, I'm going to come to you and ask you, so what do you think? It seems as though you're on the side that's against that. What does doping take away from the sport? Because I think Julian's position, or the position of the question, is asking it from a perspective of already that sport isn't fair as it currently is anyway, because there are people that are doping. So what does doping take away from the sport?
Well, doping, I think about it in two different ways. I think doping robs the sport of integrity, and it takes from the public the right to believe in champions, which is a terrible thing to lose. Imagine there are people now, and there are lots of people who say, I don't watch the Olympics anymore because I don't know what to believe. And that is a travesty for all people who love sport. But what doping also does is it takes away from the individual athlete the right to know how good that man or woman could be. Because once you take doping, it's not actually you, it's you plus chemical enhancement. And when I think about, legalizing doping in any way, I think about a situation, let me quote you an example. Floyd Landis, when he talked about his doping as a professional cyclist, he won the Tour de France in 2006. It was taken away from him because of doping. He said, when I took human growth hormone, they were terrible for me because they made my muscles stiff and they didn't help. George Hincapie said, when I doped on the US postal team, human growth hormone was my drug. It was great for me, it worked. So what you end up with then, if we allow doping, are the athletes who will do best are the athletes whose bodies respond best to doping. So it's never actually going to be a playing field if you legalize doping products, because just as I give you an antibiotic because you're sick, I take an antibiotic we don't necessarily respond in the same way. So if we apply that principle to doping, we end up with the champion being the guy whose metabolism, his system, his innate DNA responded well to doping. And is that the kind of champion we want?
Can I respond to that?
Yeah, Julian, straight in, please.
I think David and Kira have raised some very important points, which I think I'd just like to respond to. I think it's important to start with reality and not some fantasy. So with respect to the facts about doping, when Michael Ashenden, an independent doping expert, reanalysed the blood specimens from the London Olympics, he estimated that a third of the medals involved suspicious values. When WADA itself, the World Anti-Doping Agency, did an anonymous survey at the Pan-Arab and the Commonwealth Games, they found that 45% of athletes admitted to doping in the last year in the Pan-Arab Games and about a third in the Commonwealth Games. Those are the facts. Last time I looked, 10 people had run less than 9.8 seconds, ever. 9 of them have been implicated in doping. It's only Usain Bolt that hasn't been involved in doping that we know of. Ben Johnson said, if you want a human being to run under 10 seconds, you have to cope with the injuries in order to train that hard. You have to take steroids to enable you to continue to train. The reality is that the sport that we require from people today means that many people are doping. Now, with respect to doping determining the outcome and who responds best to the dope, well, we already have legal doping. We have caffeine. Caffeine improves the time to exhaustion by 10%. So famously, the sprint cyclist from the UK who won a number of gold medals in track said, I have 5 espressos before I do my race. We have people who take glucose and creatine. Those enhance performance. Of course, the interaction between a substance and your body is going to affect performance. That's just what sport is. It's the interaction between a whole range of different features of our physiology and the sort of things that we take. Now, with the very interesting speed analogy, I completely agree. If you've got all these people breaking the speed limit at 70 and you just raise it to 90, you're going to get the same number of people breaking. There's no point in raising the speed limit. But if you move to more enforceable limits, like physiological limits, like a hematocrit, red blood cell percentage in your blood of 50%, that's very easy to pick up. Rather than trying to pick up small deviations within the normal range, it will be more enforceable. The problem today is zero tolerance. And the reality is physiological amounts of doping that athletes are taking with testosterone, growth hormone, EPO, aren't dangerous and they're impossible to detect. You could easily change the rules and make them more enforceable. That's why it would be easier to pick up people at 90 than it would be at 70, unlike the car example.
Julian, a simple question. You've just said, thrown it out, people might mistake it for a fact. EPO is not dangerous, you said. I've just written
I said physiological doses. Anything is dangerous if you have enough. Water will kill you if you drink enough. Caffeine will kill you.
Can I finish the point?
Yeah.
You said EPO is not dangerous. I've just written a book with Yulia Stepanova and her husband Vitaly, who blew the whistle on Russian doping. Yulia was part of the Russian system and she used EPO. What the EPO did to her body was that because she had to supplement, if you're using EPO, you've got to take a lot of extra iron because that's needed in the processing. Once your red cells go up, you need supplementary iron. She stopped taking EPO now. But because of what she's been through, her body is producing really high iron levels. Now she can cope with that as long as she's exercising intensely, as she is. She runs every day for maybe 2 hours. She knows that as soon as she stops running, the medical experts have told her you're going to need to go on really serious medication to cope with your excessive iron levels, which is seriously dangerous. So when people say that such and such a drug is not that dangerous, they're saying stuff that is really dangerous.
I'm actually a doctor, and I'll say this: EPO is given every day to patients extremely safely. What you probably had in this situation is somebody who wasn't given it in a medically supervised way, who probably had underlying hemochromatosis. Iron overload is common as a problem with people who have a genetic abnormality. You treat it by giving blood donations regularly. Now, I'm not saying that unsupervised doping is safe. That's the real problem. Today, what you have is a black market of doping with people taking bad blood, unsupervised doses of steroids, EPO in the wrong way, and of course that's dangerous. That's why it needs to be medically supervised.
Just bringing in Kira on this one, right? How difficult is it as an athlete? Obviously, there's like a list of banned substances that are used and so on and so forth. How difficult is it as an athlete to keep up with, the ever-growing list of things that are now placed on that? And what do you do?
Well, there is an app. The WADA has an app that you can check all the medication that is illegal. The Dutch Doping Authority also has an app that's the one I check if for anything I need to know if it's legal or not. Also, since I was very young, our national team always had these educational sessions about the doping, prohibited substances. And I think education on the subject is a very important part of getting the sport clean, because I think that a lot of people in countries where doping is not very controversial are not educated in why it's not good for the sport. And I think that is a big part of the problem. So I think good education and just checking everything you take. Like if I take a vitamin supplement, there is, in the UK you have informed sports testing, and in the Netherlands we have also a national system that checks all the supplements. So a company can send in their supplements, they get checked on banned substances, and if they are checked well, then they get a trademark or
like a seal.
They get a seal of this supplement doesn't contain any prohibited substances. So I only take things that are checked by either Informed Sports or the Dutch system that is in place. So I cannot just go to the grocery store or to the pharmacy to get any vitamin C supplement, because that's not checked and I don't know what is actually in there.
Okay. There's been loads of cases and I understand like both sides of this argument. But there's also been like loads of cases in some sport where dangerous sports. What about dangerous sports such as like boxing, for example, where opponents could be, killed in the ring? That's happened several times. What's your thoughts on performance enhancements within that framework? Because there's a lot that goes on within that sport. So what's your thoughts on that, Julian?
First of all, boxing is a lot more dangerous than doping in sport. And so I think that it's a general question of what level of risk are you going to allow people to take in sport. And if doping increases that risk, I think significantly, I think it's a candidate to be banned. So, for example, I don't think you should be able to take analgesics in boxing to be able to compete, for longer with worse injuries. I don't believe you should be able to take drugs which reduce your fear. So Mike Tyson famously said he would take cocaine before boxing, because I think part of boxing is dealing with your fear and dealing with your pain.
Yeah.
And in this case, these sorts of agents are unsafe and undermine the spirit of boxing. So I think that, cocaine, angel dust, analgesics, not anti-inflammatory drugs in boxing or to be banned. They're easy to pick up because they're not natural to your body. Your body doesn't produce angel dust or cocaine, so you can do a simple test to pick those up and see who's cheating. That's why those sorts of bans are easy to implement. But bans on growth hormone, testosterone, EPO are almost impossible to enforce because the body produces those substances itself, and within normal limits, they're safe. So I think there will be cases of substances that you do want to ban. So, for example, in soccer and American football and rugby, I think analgesics, anti-inflammatory drugs, local anaesthetics during competition ought to be banned because they're unsafe and they undermine the spirit of the sport of dealing with the pain that occurs during competition.
But if you just said that if you stop, if you have the rule that you let people stop at 70, and that if somebody stopped at 70, you cannot check the other people, how are you gonna check everybody? Because you cannot test everybody at all times before and after every competition on every level. So if you would allow some sort of doping, but not everything, how are you going to enforce that?
Well, you'll use the limited resources that you have now, the sort of $20 million or something that WADA has a year, in a more focused and more productive way. So I think in 2012, WADA did 25,000 tests for EPO. Only 40 of them came back positive. And there's no way that that accurately represents the number of athletes that are taking EPO. If you want to test for substances like tramadol, which is an opioid analgesic that's used in cycling, that's very easy to pick up. Even a trace amount will be able to be picked up in your blood. So, of course, you won't be able to eliminate doping. You won't be able to create a completely level playing field, but you'll be able to do better than we're currently doing. And I think the reality is that a zero-tolerance approach has failed. And we ought to rethink the enormous banned list that the World Anti-Doping Agency has and focus on the things which are really dangerous and which are really against the spirit of the sport, like analgesics and opioid analgesics and non-steroidals in full contact competition.
David, has it failed?
Yeah, there is a feeling out there that the anti-doping system has failed, that people are still cheating and getting away with it. And I think that's a simplistic view. I also think it's an uneducated view to believe that everything is the same as before and that the anti-doping movement hasn't made some progress. And let me quote you two examples that strike me as being relevant. When President Putin put $50 billion into creating the Sochi Olympics, he created the most extravagant Winter Games that had ever been seen. In a visual sense, it might have been the most spectacular Olympic summer or winter ever seen. He also wanted his Russian athletes to be the #1 nation at the Winter Olympics of 2014 in Sochi. They were doping. They knew that there was going to be a lot of testing at the Olympics, at the Winter Olympics. And they knew that they wouldn't win the medals that they wanted if they stopped doping before the Olympics. So they keep doping. But they can't beat the system by masking their drugs. So what they do is that they build an alternative laboratory, a second lab, small office alongside the main lab. And they get the samples that the athletes give and they get them out through a mouse hole. They have an FSB guy who opens up tamper-proof bottles, replaces the urine that contains doping products with the clean urine that had been supplied months before by these different athletes. Now, the point about this is that Russia wouldn't have had to go to those incredible lengths and create this alternative system of this alternative lab unless the testing worked. To a degree, the testing is working. And Julian mentioned all those EPO tests and only 40 positives. The tests exist to deter people. If people know they're going to be tested, they're far more likely not to dope. a sport that I've covered for the last 40 years, basically, as a journalist, is the Tour de France. And I've seen lots of doped winners of the Tour de France who I knew were doping. And if you said to me now, David, if you said, what about that young Colombian guy who won last year? He looked spectacular. What about him? I would say I believe he's clean. I think he's an extraordinary talent who has had the advantage of growing up in a city at altitude, Zipaquira, in Colombia. So that has been a natural advantage he had. But I think and believe he won last year's Tour de France clean. Now, that wasn't possible for most of my time watching the Tour de France. It is possible now, because if we properly apply ourselves to tackling people who cheat, we can do it. What I believe we don't need to do is to say, let's legalize it to a certain level. Because as Kira has said, and what I believe is that that certain level will be just something for the cheats to try and get beyond. And let me say one thing about sport. There's always a feeling that if we were to do this officially, if we bring in more doctors and we supervise it and we allow a certain amount of this and certain, if we do that, we'll make sport somehow cleaner, or there will be less risk. When doctors came into sport and worked with teams, in my experience, the doping didn't go down, it went up. And the Tour de France and the cycling was a great example of that. Everybody used to say, if we could get a doctor working with the team, an official, medically qualified doctor, things will get better. When those guys came into the sport, things got worse.
It sounds similar to like accountants and tax avoidance in essence. From that from that standpoint, that I mean, do you think human beings are predisposed to trying to find a way around things? And I think is that what I think Julian's point is kind of like towards the fact that this is what human beings are going to do. Period. Would that be
I agree with you. I agree with Julian. I totally agree with that. Everybody wants to hitch their system to an outside motor. Mm-hmm. The idea that you could attach yourself to something that will allow you to transcend your own natural limitations is a very seductive thought. When people meet somebody very rich, they want to say to the guy or the woman, tell me what it is that you did that made you rich, as if it was one thing. Like, what is the secret? In the same way, people are looking for that product. That's something. When in actual fact, it should be a whole string of very small things, as well as you having a lot of natural talent for that. What you want to be, should be based on your talent and your hard work and your dedication and all of that stuff. And one other thing about doping. So many people down through the years have said to me, why don't we just allow them do what they want, basically? Mm-hmm. Let them take what they want. And I say to that person, so you're a 45-year-old dad and your 18-year-old son or daughter comes to you and says, Dad, I've got to take anabolic steroids now to get me to the next level, or I've got to take EPO. What do you say to your own kid? Most people say, I tell him not to do it. And my next question is always then, so why would you apply a different morality for somebody else's kids? And they get stuck at that point.
Well, I'm very, I get what Julian is saying, but I just really disagree, because like the beauty of sports is that, okay, so when I got accused of using doping, well, maybe I should tell a little backstory, because...
Yeah, please.
Yeah, so in 2018, I had a World Cup swimming in China. And in that season, I was doing very well. I broke national records every other week, and so I got tested like 6-7 weekends in a row. I got back home, and 2 months later I was back in China again for the World Championships, and I got an email from FINA, the World Swimming organization, that I had a positive test when I was at the World Cup in Beijing. And my whole world collapsed. I had to fly home. The federation sent me home, and the substance that I supposedly tested positive for was called tylobuterol, which is asthmatic medication. So in the end, 3 months later, it turned out that the lab in Beijing made a mistake, and they switched another medication that I use for that medication because it has the same molecular structure or the same mass, molecular weight. And so I could prove myself that I didn't actually use that substance and that I was innocent. But still, the World Championships that I got sent home from, it felt to me that they got taken away from me.
Yeah.
And what when I got accused of doping, to me that was the worst thing that could happen to me. Like I broke all these records because I worked hard and I performed well. I got better with training, and then all of a sudden, people were thinking that I was cheating, and that was the reason that my performance were better. And you could accuse me of anything, but cheating, like using doping, was to me the worst thing that I could be accused of. That people would think that of me. And to me, that's the worst thing. That shows to me that I really believe in clean sports, because if what David said earlier, that if you won a gold medal and you know that you have achieved it yourself by hard working, by your dedication, by all the years of training you put in, then I think you can be really proud of what you have accomplished. But if you know that you have cheated to get there, I think for me that will take so much away from the feeling of being the best. That's my point of view on it.
Definitely. I was going to say, because that happens sometimes, doesn't it, David? Like, some people do end up getting accused of cheating, or it becomes apparent that some people do get accused of cheating, but then they haven't done. But then they're also stripped of something or an opportunity that they could have really pressed on and done well at. Is that just a I don't know, a piece of collateral damage that we have to accept when it comes to then keeping doping out of sport, or is there a way of getting better at doing that?
No, it's a very difficult situation for sure, because the only way the anti-doping system works is by holding every athlete responsible for what goes into their body. And there are occasions where an athlete will do absolutely nothing wrong, but maybe gets a contaminated substance, or maybe something happens that they ingest or take something that they totally unknowingly take a doping product. And you would hope that the system would admit its mistakes. But there are going to be mistakes for sure, because it's impossible to say what was in somebody's mind when the doping product went in their system, or whether they had even any knowledge of it. But at the same time, that's the only system that works, by holding athletes accountable for what's in their bodies. They have to explain it, basically.
But doesn't Julian, would you argue that your view then protects, in essence, those athletes from the situation where they might end up losing out on the peak of their career or the peak of their powers? because of an accusation of doping if it was legal in that sense?
Look, I mean, if I don't have any flesh in the game, unlike David and Kira, so I'm just a sort of an observer. And my observation is not the same as David's, that the system is working. He mentions the Russians in Sochi. They beat the system. The only way they got caught was through an informant. And it's the same with Lance Armstrong, passed 200 tests. The only reason he was caught was because of the forced testimony of his teammates who escaped penalties. Larry Bowers, the expert from the US Anti-Doping Agency, said in the Armstrong inquiry, a negative test does not equate to the absence of doping. So I agree with Kira and David. If you could have a clean sport, it'd be great. I'm not an evangelist for doping, but the system is failing. And the problem is that you're trying to pick up people with limited resources on a whole bunch of different parameters, most of which don't work, like, for example, meldonium isn't a performance enhancer, isn't unsafe. And so the athlete gets caught up in a system which has got way too few resources for picking up the things that matter. So if you started to draw some lines that were enforceable, that were realistic and that were important, and put your resources into that, you wouldn't have so many mistaken false positives. You will have some, as David said. System's never going to be perfect. But the problem is, it's a disaster that you've got billions of dollars at stake. Pressures to dope are enormous. The probability of detection is very small. It's hugely widespread. You've got basically no testing, and you've got these limited resources in labs trying to do, the best they can. It's just not a functional system, and the athlete gets caught up in it even when they're clean, and it's just an inappropriate use of limited resources. So I think my only call is to, why don't we rethink where we're going and try to draw the lines a bit better? This is what we did with caffeine. Caffeine used to be illegal. Now it's legal. It's a performance enhancer. It hasn't destroyed the spectacle of sport. It's much easier to enforce because you don't have to work out whether somebody had a can of Coke 2 hours before their race and that's the cause of their positive caffeine rating. So what we did for caffeine, we could do for other things and then make the system more enforceable and fairer for the athletes. Why don't we consider it?
Yeah, well, just a couple of points, Julian. You made the point about all the tests that Lance Armstrong passed, and he certainly passed a lot. One of the reasons why he wasn't caught was after failing a test in the 1999 tour, his first tour victory. The authorities covered up. The anti-doping system worked on that tour. It picked up his triamcinolone violation, but they covered up for him. So, and the second point I would make about Lance is that I heard him do a podcast in 2018, and he was asked about doping in the peloton now and how he felt about it. And he felt it was a much cleaner race now, and he was asked why. He said, in my day, he said, like for my first two tours, they didn't even have a test for EPO. Of course, they've got a test now. He said, in my day, they didn't do any out-of-competition testing. Now they're all over the athletes in terms of out-of-competition testing. And he said, I have zero doubt that I could get away with now what I did then. And I think that's relevant. And I would say to you, I don't know how closely you follow sports in terms of the events, but if you were to believe me, let's say you believe me, when I tell you that the young Colombian who won the Tour de France last year won it clean, you might say, David, that's only your opinion. And I would say, you're right, Julian, it's only my opinion. But I have been watching the race for 40 years. And when I say watching, as in working on it, on the race every day. Most of the time during those 40 years, I would have said to you, this guy's doped, this guy's doped. I'm the arch skeptic.
Yeah,
right?
Look, I agree with you.
Can you let me finish? Let me finish? Because I'm asking you I want to ask you a question. So if you said, David, I trust you as a as a journalist who's giving an honest appraisal here. And if you're telling me that Egan Bernal, who won last year's tour, is clean, I believe you. Well, what would that mean? That after 40 years maybe of dirty tours, we may be in an era now where it's clean. Is that not progress? Is that not something we should be aspiring towards? And one thing I would say to you about a Colombian winning the Tour de France now, it's not a coincidence. Because when EPO was undetectable and was being used by cyclists in vast amounts, it destroyed Colombia as a cycling country. Because what Colombia had, their cyclists, they didn't have the strength of the Europeans, but they had the ability to climb mountains because many of them had grown up at altitude. And that gave them what I would regard as a natural advantage. They didn't have the material wealth of Western Europe or America, but they had terrain that was terrific. EPO comes along and it gives incredible endurance to all the heavy, stronger Europeans, and Colombians disappear from the face of cycling. The authorities get on top of the EPO problem. It's very difficult to use now, and the Colombians and the Ecuadorians, last 2019, 3 Grand Tours, 2 of them won by South Americans. First guys from South America to ever win a Grand Tour. 2 of them do it in 1 year. Now that's because the authorities have got on top of the EPO problem. And to me, that's admirable and laudable and represents much fairer competition.
So, look, I hope you're right. I love watching the Tour. I like Egan Bernal. I like Chris Froome. I want to believe that they're clean. But I've heard this now for 20 years. We've got to test for EPO. We've got to test for growth hormone. And time and again, those claims, people find a way around them. What people are doing now is they're not just using EPO, they're using blood doping, which is very difficult to detect. And then someone will come and say, oh, we've got to test for blood doping, and the athletes will find a way around that. The times that Chris Froome is doing now are still faster than the times when doping was rife. Now, maybe it's marginal gains, as Sky says. I hope it is. I hope you're right. And then we don't need to have this debate. But all I can say is over the last 20 years, time and time again, doping has reappeared. And maybe it's time to rethink it. You're right that doping is reduced. The biological passport has reduced the level of it. But still, people will try and find a way around it. And maybe we should work out what ways around it are safe and consistent with the sport, and what ways around it should we really be focusing on. I mean, the other thing to say about modern cycling is, yes, you know, I'm sure there's less than when Lance Armstrong was racing. He won 7 tours. They couldn't reassign his medals because 20 out of 21 of the podium finishers had also been involved in doping. It was extremely common and extremely severe. But what happens today are therapeutic use exemptions. You know, so people now are finding a way to get corticosteroids through therapeutic use exemptions that then are using the sort of medical route to access performance enhancement.
I'd like to comment on
but Julian, you say people are now using therapeutic use exemptions. So, okay, in last year, Team Sky won the Tour de France. Did they have anybody with the therapeutic use exemption in the race?
Well, I certainly know Bradley Wiggins when he won.
No.
Under allegations
I said last year. Last year, we know.
I don't know. As I said, I hope it's all clean. I love.
But Julian, if you hope it's all clean, and you're kind of conceding that you don't know whether anybody from Team Ineos last year who won the Tour de France had a TUE. You don't know whether they had or not. I do know, and they didn't have. Now, so I'm never going to say something like they're now using TUEs. What I'm looking for is evidence of people using TUEs. And I think it's kind of very easy to throw out a general observation, they're all using TUEs now, without knowing. You know, do you not feel a responsibility to actually check that comment out
Well, I do know Bradley Wiggins has had several TUEs, and this was a sort of cast a shadow over his win of the tour.
Bradley Wiggins had 3 TUEs, and they totally destroy the integrity of his 2012 victory in the Tour de France. I totally agree with that. Now, that was 8 years ago. Last year, Egan Bernal won the Tour. He didn't have a TUE. The previous year, Geraint Thomas won the Tour de France. He didn't have a TUE. Chris Froome never had a TUE in the Tour de France. Now, so, if we go back 8 years, we find a TUE. Since then, in the winners of the Tour de France, we don't. My belief is that if we keep working with the system we've got, we put more resources into it, we can make it more robust, stronger, and we can achieve something.
Well, I'm going to go to our athlete and just ask her a final question. Do you think we could ever completely monitor it? The usage of
well, no, I don't think so, because there will always be people that find a way around it. But I really hope that, for example, I get tested about every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks I have an out of competition test, as if right now. Well, I hope all the athletes I'm competing against have the same thing, but I don't know that. So that is something as an athlete that you kind of always wonder if your opponents are tested as often as you are yourself. But I think there will always be people that go find a way around the rules, but that's with everything. That's with law enforcement as well. So that wouldn't be different with doping, I think. But I hope that if the tests get more frequent, also on a lower level. So I think the use of doping is a lot more frequent in lower level athletes. Mm-hmm. So because they want to get to the top and they don't have many tests yet. And then if they are at the level that they will get tested, well, I guess I don't know how people would do that, because maybe if they stop, they would lose their advantage and also their level of competing. But for example, in swimming, it's a very highly technical sport. So doping is, I think, less helpful than in sports that are very endurance based or strength based. But I don't think it will ever really get out of the sport. But I think we can, by very good enforcement, we can get it to a very low level. Well, that's what I hope, at least.
Absolutely. Well, guys, it's been an absolutely rip-roaring debate, and I think we could debate this thing for for all day if we had the time, to be honest with you. There's loads of viewpoints on both sides of the spectrum, and I'm sure all our listeners will have loved all of the insight that you guys have brought surrounding this topic. Definitely you, Kira, as an athlete as well. I think that insight of what it was like for you to be accused of doping and what the impact of that was on you and your championship. So, guys, I just want to thank you so much for that. We do have some questions from our listeners as well. So I'm going to fire those off. Firstly, I'm going to go to you, Kira. What's it been like to train during lockdown? And have you managed to get to the pool often? I've only been out of the pool for 1 month. They opened up the pools for just the national team with very strict rules, so to deal with the coronavirus. But I've been able to train a lot, and now we have a competition coming up next week. So let's see where I stand right now. So I'm very excited for that because I miss competing a lot. Yeah. So what did you do during that month that you had off? What was you?
Well, I borrowed somebody's bike and I started cycling, but I saw very quickly that my body is not very built for cycling, and then I started running. Same story. So I did a lot of strength exercises in my house, and I also have a stationary bike in my living room. It's still standing here. So I did a lot of cycling and watching Netflix at the same time to not let it be so boring.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I saw you. You've been putting up some workouts, some live workouts that you've been doing during the lockdown period. What's it like having the Olympics postponed by a year? I know quite a few athletes. Like I said, I work across multiple different sports, definitely in boxing, who are really gearing up and excited about the Olympics. So how's it been having it postponed for a year, and have you had to alter your training?
Well, at first I was really disappointed because I was doing really well. Last December I had my first individual European Championships medal. So I was really improving and really, getting, we always call it getting on the train. So if you get on the train, everything is going well. All the positives add up to each other.
Yeah.
Well, that's how it feels, at least. And so I was fairly disappointed. But then after that disappointment faded away, I realized that I was doing well, but I wasn't quite there yet. I am in the top 8 in the world right now in my events, and now I have an extra year to reach the top 3. So that's how I see it now, and that's how I approach my training right now. So I turn it into something positive, to having extra time for an extra year of training.
Incredible. Thank you. Thank you for those two. I'm sure our listeners that put those in would love those answers. David, over to you next. What was it like for you when Armstrong finally came clean about doping, and what does this mean for the sport, or for sport in general? For all sport.
What it was like, David, was kind of a little bit anticlimactic in a way, because you had this big moment when the United States Anti-Doping Agency released its reasoned decision and gave Lance a lifetime ban and took away his 7 tours. But it had been a story that I'd been on for 12, 13 years at that time, and I was pretty convinced from the very first week of the first year that this guy was cheating, and you're chipping away at trying to convince people that this is a fraud, this guy isn't who he says he is, and the sport still has a very serious problem. And when the truth eventually is acknowledged, it's like, whatever, I mean, yeah. It was obvious. But it was an important moment for the sport in general, the sport of cycling in particular, sport in general, because it kind of said, you know what, you may get away with it for a certain amount of time. You may be acclaimed as a great champion. You may get the $100 million endorsement from Nike, whatever. But the cheating you did may come back to haunt you. It may emerge. And in Lance's case, it came back spectacularly. And an athlete who was probably one of the most admired, iconic figures in the world of sport suddenly became a byword for all that was wrong in sport. And maybe in the history of sport, it was the most spectacular fall, because Lance came from such a high place.
Yeah.
And it was, you could say that it was a terrible thing for all the people who had survived cancer, who hadn't survived, who had believed in Lance, who had drawn inspiration from them, and it was all a lie. That was a difficult thing for people.
Absolutely, without a shadow of a doubt. Especially people that were inspired to start and step into sport, or into that sport of cycling, because of him.
Yeah, the amount of times that people have said to me, I so believed in Lance, and I used to read what you were writing, and I hated you for doing it. And, those kind of people, I totally understand. It was like William Butler Yeats, the poet, had a line that said, "Tread softly because you tread on my dreams." And when you were writing bad things about Lance Armstrong, you were treading on people's dreams.
absolutely, which must have been difficult.
Yeah,
from that perspective. But.
yeah, it was. But it was the right thing.
Absolutely. Well, you've written a new book. You touched on it on the Russian doping scandal. Would you be able to tell us? I know you touched a little bit about it. Would you tell us just a little bit about it?
It's called The Russian Affair, and it's about Vitaly and Yulia Stepanov. He was a guy who worked for the Russian anti-doping agency. He believed in clean sport. He believed in fighting for it. He falls in love with a woman who's an 800-meter runner and part of Russia's doping system. She tells him on their first date that she uses doping, and he says that he thinks this is wrong, and she tells him to get wise because everybody in Russia dopes, she says. And when she had spoken to her coach would have said, do you think it's any different in the US or in the UK or in Germany or in Holland or any other country in Western Europe? They all do it. So she becomes convinced it's the only choice she's got.
Yeah.
So they get married. He's the anti-doping guy. She's the confirmed doper, and it's a dysfunctional relationship, as it was always going to be. He betrays her by writing emails to the World Anti-Doping Agency saying most Russian athletes dope, and I can tell you the details about my wife. So he tells them what she's been doing. She's been involved in a relationship with her coach. So she's betraying him in the personal sense during their marriage. They're about to get divorced. Ending a marriage that probably should never have happened in the first place. And she gets a ban for athlete biological passport irregularities. And she says to her coach, what do I do? I'm not going to be able to run for 2 years. It's all I've got. And he says, well, what you do now is you do what every Russian woman does when she gets a ban for doping. Start your family. And she said, we have filed for divorce. And he said, well, I can't help you there. So she thinks about her life, because at the moment this happens, she's in the Crimea in the Ukraine getting mud treatment for her injuries. And she's on her own. And she thinks about all the men she's been involved in Russian sport, the coaches, the doctors, the officials. And she realizes they were all using her. And the one person who loved her, her husband, she hadn't reciprocated his love. And now that she didn't have running, she could feel, she could see her life in a stark relief. Yeah. And she thinks, I've been an idiot here. And she rings up her husband and says, how about we don't get divorced? And he's always loved her. So he thinks, okay. And they give it another chance. And he says, now that we're going to keep our marriage going, you can't run. You must come on to my side of the doping argument and work with me. And she says, I will. And all the recordings, the secret recordings and the secret videoing that brought the system in Russia down were done by Yulia Stepanova, the former 800-meter runner. She went into meetings with top officials, top coaches, top medical officer, and she recorded them all. She recorded her friend Maria Savinova, 800-meter runner, Olympic champion from 2012. And when they were doing this as a couple, they got closer. And they had a son, Robert, at this time. And their marriage, from being pretty dysfunctional, became a loving, good marriage. With the arrival of Robert, their son, they end up in a family situation, and they're still very much together now and very close. So it's like a love story set against the backdrop of a doping conspiracy. And I think it's the love story that makes the book interesting.
Incredible. It sounds incredibly gripping. I'm gonna have to give that a look myself. Honestly, it sounds incredibly gripping. What was it? Yeah, Julian.
Yes.
Over to you. what first interested you in the ethics of sport and specifically doping?
Well, I've always enjoyed sport, just recreationally, so I love it. I like doing it. But I had a medical student who came to me for an elective just before the Sydney Olympics, and I said to her, because I was interested in enhancement generally, and I said, well, why don't you see what's going on in doping in sport? There must be some stuff there that works now, you know. And this medical student with no background in ethics or sports science came back with some facts that made it obvious in the early 2000s that doping was everywhere and that the regulation of it was laughable. The World Anti-Doping Agency had this criterion that, you know, you should ban a substance if it's against the spirit of sport. And it had this list of things like courage, honesty, teamwork as defining the spirit of sport. So we wrote a piece. So then I called up a colleague who was in charge of the testing at the Sydney Olympics, and I said to him, can you pick up growth hormone if athletes are taking it? And he said, no. And I said, do you think it's dangerous? And he said, well, if they take a lot, they'll get a large jaw and large hands, but if they don't take that much, it's not dangerous. And I suddenly realised this is everywhere, and this whole system is a farce. So we wrote a piece that got on the front page of the newspaper, and then we wrote an article that was very highly cited. But so it was obvious in the early 2000s that Lance Armstrong, the whole peloton were doping, if you just bothered to even look superficially at the evidence. So, you know, I just took it on as a hobby. But, you know, nothing has changed as far as I can see. Yes, it's maybe been reduced a bit, but, you know, it's a fascinating human story.
And that about wraps up this week's episode of Myprotein's The Scoop podcast. A huge thank you to all of our guests, Kira, David and Julian, who's given us some incredible insight surrounding doping in sports. Please keep the conversation going via social media using the hashtag The Scoop, and indeed in the comments too. Don't worry, we'll be back soon for another episode. I've been David Aloka, and thanks for listening.